Forget what you've been told about the obedient, soft-spoken, domestic woman of the Middle Ages. The image of the medieval tradwife, the loyal homemaker who served, obeyed, and smiled beneath her wimple, is a lie written long after the fact. It was crafted not by the women who lived through those brutal centuries, but by men who feared what those women had endured and what they had become. Marriage in the Middle Ages was no fairy tale. It was a contract, an exchange, a negotiation of property and bloodlines. Love, if it existed, was a luxury. For peasants, a wedding might mean joining 2 fields, 2 oxen, or 2 debts. For nobles, it meant forging alliances that could alter kingdoms. A girl could be married off at 12, sometimes younger, her body and future sealed by signatures she never gave. And yet, within that cage, she learned to survive. While the church preached obedience and purity, reality was far less poetic. Husbands left for war, for pilgrimage, or never returned at all. Famine and plague tore families apart. Entire villages of women were left to till fields, brew ale, tend animals, and defend homes. The good wife ideal collapsed the moment the world demanded survival. In truth, the medieval woman was the backbone of the household, not because she was obedient, but because she had no choice. The laws said she was her husband's property, but when he fell in battle, she became judge, steward, and protector. She was expected to raise children, feed the family, spin cloth, and keep faith. Yet when she succeeded, she was invisible. When she failed, she was blamed. To the church, she was Eve, the source of sin. To men, she was fragile. But to life itself, she was indispensable. Look closer at a peasant's hut in winter. The husband may be gone, but the wife is there, grinding grain by candlelight, kneading coarse bread for hungry mouths, mending clothes with fingers cracked from cold. She is up before dawn, and when night falls, she still works. This is no tradwife in the modern sense. This is a laborer, a strategist, a survivor. Even noble women, dressed in silk and guarded by servants, carried invisible burdens. When their husbands rode to war, they managed vast estates, handled disputes, and sometimes even commanded garrisons. Eleanor of Aquitaine ruled lands larger than most kings. Her life was a rebellion against the cage built for her, and she shattered every expectation of what a wife should be. And yet, for every woman who led armies, thousands more lived unseen. They worked themselves into early graves so that men could dream of their obedient wives, those who were, in truth, only obedient to necessity. The ideal of submission never fit the world they inhabited. They bent to it, yes, but they bent like iron under heat, not broken, merely reforged. So, the next time someone speaks of traditional wives from the medieval past, remember this. Tradition was never their choice. It was their battlefield. And the miracle is not that they endured it quietly, it's that they endured it at all. When dawn broke over a medieval village, the first sound wasn't a church bell. It was the sound of women working. The myth of idle wives keeping tidy homes fades quickly under the weight of what their days truly demanded. Women were not ornaments to the household. They were the household. Every loaf of bread, every thread of wool, every candle that burned in the dark passed through their hands. Peasant women rose before the sun, long before their husbands stirred. They baked coarse rye bread, milked cows, gathered firewood, fed chickens, and carried water in buckets heavy enough to bend their backs. Then they went to the fields, sowing, reaping, gleaning, and hauling the same loads as men. No one called it equality. It was survival. Their labor didn't grant them freedom, but it sustained everyone else's. In medieval records, their names rarely appear, But their fingerprints are everywhere. Women brewed ale, baked bread, spun flax, wove cloth, and tended vegetable plots that fed entire households. In some English towns, over half the brewers were women, called alewives. Their work was essential, but the law soon began taxing it, regulating it, and, in many cases, forbidding it. The church claimed female work distracted them from virtue. The irony? Without that work, no one ate. In cities, women filled the markets. They sold butter, cheese, cloth, and herbs. They ran taverns and inns. A woman could be a tailor, a shoemaker, even a blacksmith, if she inherited the forge or worked beside her husband. Some guilds allowed female members. Others barred them. But where the door was closed, women slipped through windows, registering their businesses under a son's or brother's name, working in the shadows of legality. In noble estates, labor took a different shape, but it was no less demanding. A lady of the manor oversaw servants, accounted for rents, managed food supplies, and settled disputes while her husband was away. When war or plague struck, she became the de facto ruler of her domain. Margaret Paston, an English gentlewoman of the 15th century, commanded her household, negotiated property deals, and even defended her home during armed sieges, all while writing letters to her absent husband, who enjoyed the safety of London. Work blurred the boundaries between gender and class. A woman might spend her morning in the field, her noon at the market, her evening nursing a child, and her night mending nets or spinning wool by firelight. The next day, she would rise again. She worked until her fingers bled and her back ached, not for glory or virtue, but because there was no other way to live. Yet, despite their endless labor, medieval laws rarely recognized women as workers. The man held the tools, the woman's hands went uncounted. A widow might keep a shop until remarriage, but once a husband entered her life again, the law absorbed her identity into his. Her labor was his, her skill was his, her income was his. And still, they endured. They worked not for ambition, but for the fragile hope of stability, the hope that one more harvest, one more batch of ale, one more day at the loom might keep hunger from the door. The myth of the submissive wife never belonged to them. They were not delicate guardians of tradition. They were the machinery of survival, and history chose to forget how loud that machinery roared. Power in the Middle Ages wore a crown, swung a sword, and spoke in a man's voice, or so the chronicles would have us believe. But behind that glittering surface, there was another realm of power, silent, strategic, and often feminine. Women, though barred from the throne room, found ways to shape the kingdom from the shadows. They learned to speak through others, to command without seeming to rule without the title of ruler. Eleanor of Aquitaine was the perfect embodiment of this paradox. Born a duchess, married to 2 kings, and mother to 10 children, 2 of whom became kings themselves, she lived in a world that demanded she obey. Instead, she ruled. When her husband Henry II tried to silence her, she defied him, leading her sons in rebellion. When he imprisoned her for over a decade, she emerged stronger, governing England in her son Richard's absence. Her power came not from permission, but from persistence, and it frightened the men who wrote history. But not all power came draped in silk or crowned with gold. In the monasteries, women like Hildegard of Bingen commanded authority no sword could win. A visionary, healer, and composer, she corresponded with popes and emperors, advising them on matters of politics and faith. Her letters reveal a woman who saw divine truth, but also the hypocrisy of the men who claimed to guard it. "The church is like the moon," she wrote, "shining only because it reflects the light of women's souls. She was a nun who spoke as a general, and in her words, the world trembled. In the courts of kings, women were diplomats as much as daughters or wives. Marriages were treaties, and brides carried the weight of kingdoms in their dowries. Queens like Isabella of France, called the she-wolf, learned that love was secondary to strategy. Betrayed by her husband, Edward II, she raised an army against him and took the throne. Chroniclers painted her as monstrous because the Middle Ages had no language for a woman who ruled by choice. Even in the peasant class, quiet power existed. A widow could inherit her husband's land, run his workshop, or negotiate contracts. In some towns, widows were among the few women who could act independently under law, free to own property, lend money, or manage apprentices. Society feared such women. Independence in a woman was seen as dangerous, unnatural. Yet these widows became the lifeblood of medieval towns, the silent backbone of local economies. And then there were the mothers, powerful in ways the church never admitted. In a world where lineage determined destiny, a woman's womb could alter the fate of dynasties. Queens were revered when they produced sons and discarded when they didn't. Yet it was they who decided, often secretly, which heirs survived, which alliances thrived, which names carried forward. History recorded the men who ruled, but it was women who ensured those men were born. Power came with risk. A woman who commanded too boldly could be labeled a witch, a heretic, or a whore. To survive, she had to wear masks: humility, silence, obedience. But beneath those masks, the will remained unbroken. The true art of female power in the Middle Ages was invisibility. It was not the roar of a lioness, but the whisper of wind through stone corridors, unseen, unstoppable. So when we speak of medieval power, we must look not at the crowns on men's heads, but at the hands that placed them there. The women of the Middle Ages did not wait to be given power. They took it, disguised it, and carried it in secret until history was ready to notice, and often history never did. Love in the Middle Ages was never simple, and it was almost never fair. The stories that survived tell of knights serenading fair maidens, of courtly devotion beneath moonlit towers, of chaste kisses and noble vows. But beneath those romantic fictions, written by men for the pleasure of other men, lay the truth. Marriage was currency, love was danger, and desire was often a death sentence, especially for women. To the church, the body was a battlefield of sin. Women, they said, were temptresses, daughters of Eve, whose weakness had doomed mankind. Every glance, every curve, every whisper of longing was a threat to a man's soul. And yet the same world that condemned female desire also demanded women bear children without question. It was a cruel paradox. Women were needed for life, but punished for lust. In peasant villages, marriages were practical arrangements. A girl's hand might be promised by her father for a few coins, a small plot of land, or a debt repaid. Consent was rarely hers to give. Many brides met their husbands for the first time on the wedding day. And once married, she ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. Her property, her body, her labor, all became his. A wife could not refuse her husband's bed. To do so was not called survival, but sin. Yet even in this world of rigid rules, passion found its cracks. In royal courts, a strange phenomenon arose: courtly love. It was an invention of troubadours, poets who sang of forbidden devotion between noble women and knights. A woman, admired from afar, became the ideal, virtuous, untouchable, divine. But this poetic adoration was not freedom. It was fantasy. Real women bore the burden of those ideals, trapped between purity and passion. If they strayed from either, they were destroyed. Adultery, when committed by a man, was a whisper, a minor scandal at most. But for a woman, it was catastrophe. A noblewoman accused of infidelity could lose her dowry, her children, even her life. In France, adulterous wives were sometimes mutilated, their noses cut off, their heads shaved, and then paraded through the streets as warnings. For peasants, the punishment could be worse: stoning, drowning, hanging. Love was not a gift for women. It was a gamble with death. The church preached that a silent wife is a holy wife, and that obedience was the key to virtue. But not all women accepted that script. Some defied the laws of flesh and faith entirely. In convents, nuns forged bonds that defied male authority, sometimes with God, sometimes with one another. Their letters spoke in metaphors of divine love that often carried a human tenderness beneath the surface. They turned the language of passion into prayer, masking their yearning in the only way they could. Still, even holiness could not protect them. Women accused of lust or heresy were burned as witches, drowned as adulteresses, imprisoned as sinners. The line between sacred and profane was drawn not by morality, but by control. And control, in the medieval world, was always about fear. Fear of the power women held over life, over bloodlines, over the human heart itself. Love was dangerous, not because women were weak, but because they were strong, because love gave them something no law could steal: choice. To love, to desire, to refuse, these were acts of rebellion, and rebellion, in any form, was unforgivable. So when we picture the medieval wife, remember this: behind the veil, behind the quiet smile, was a woman living in tension between faith and flesh, obedience and desire. She may have played the part of the devoted spouse, but her heart beat to a rhythm the church could never sanctify. In her silence, there was defiance. In her devotion, danger. And in her love, power. Faith was the air of the Middle Ages. It filled the cathedrals and the hovels alike, binding the powerful and the powerless under one terrifying promise: salvation or damnation. For most, the church was law, medicine, and truth combined. But for women, faith was both a cage and a key, a world that demanded obedience, yet offered, in rare and perilous moments, the chance to wield the voice of God. To the church, the ideal woman was Mary, pure, humble, silent. But most women lived lives closer to Eve, burdened by sin, pain, and suspicion. And yet faith was often the only weapon they could wield without fear of open rebellion. By becoming servants of God, many women found a path toward learning, leadership, and something close to independence. The convent became both prison and refuge. Behind convent walls, a quiet revolution brewed. Women who were denied the right to speak in public found freedom in the written word, in art, in song, in visions. Hildegard of Bingen, abbess, scientist, composer, prophet, shattered every expectation of what a woman could be. She wrote music that echoed through cathedrals, letters that chastised emperors, and theological texts that questioned male authority itself. Man was created from the dust, she wrote, but woman was born from light. Her faith was not submission, it was fire. Others followed the same dangerous path. Catherine of Siena, a mystic who fasted herself nearly to death, dictated letters to the Pope himself, demanding reform in the church. Her frail body became her armor. The more she suffered, the more divine her words were believed to be. To the church, she was a saint. To the men around her, she was a threat wrapped in holiness. But not every woman of faith was revered. For every saint who rose to the altar, countless others were condemned. Women who claimed visions without church approval were branded heretics. Those who healed the sick with herbs or midwifery were accused of witchcraft. The boundary between the sacred and the forbidden was razor thin, and only men could decide which side a woman stood on. Joan of Arc crossed that line with fire in her hands. A teenage girl who claimed to hear God's voice, she led armies, crowned kings, and terrified a nation. She wore armor, defied men, and turned faith into war. For that, she was betrayed, captured, and burned alive by the very church she had sworn to serve. Her ashes scattered in the wind, but her defiance lingered for centuries, proof that a woman's faith could shake kingdoms. Even in small villages, faith gave women a language to express what life had denied them. A mother praying over her child's fever, a widow lighting a candle for a husband lost to war. These were quiet acts of power. Faith became the thread that held them together when law, poverty, and men tore them apart. Yet that same faith demanded their silence. The church told them to bow, to serve, to obey. And still they sang hymns that carried hidden meanings, prayers whispered with longing, tears that no priest could ever interpret. Faith made martyrs of some and saints of others. It burned women who spoke too loudly, yet immortalized those who died beautifully. It was a game of contradictions, salvation offered with one hand, fire with the other. The women of faith in the Middle Ages lived at the edge of holiness and heresy. Their devotion was not meekness, it was defiance disguised as prayer. They obeyed with their lips, but not with their hearts. And when the world silenced them, they turned that silence into something eternal. The echo of a hymn that still haunts the stones of every cathedral they once touched. By the late Middle Ages, the Church's grip had tightened, fear had replaced faith, and women who once healed and nurtured their communities began to vanish into smoke. The world had changed, and with it, the way society saw female power. What was once sacred became suspicious. What was once wisdom became witchcraft. The midwife had long been the village's quiet savior, she who brought life into the world. She knew the mysteries of the body, the cycles of the moon, the herbs that eased pain, the prayers that calmed frightened mothers. But the Church saw danger in such knowledge. To control life was to play God, and only men of the cloth could claim such authority. So the midwife, who had once been blessed, became an enemy. Her tools, herbs, charms, whispered rituals were reinterpreted as marks of the devil. The transformation was slow but devastating. In sermons, priests warned that witches could steal fertility, spoil milk, and cause miscarriages. When famine struck, when a storm ruined crops, when a newborn died, suspicion turned toward the women who had once been trusted most. A healer's hut became a witch's lair. Her remedies became curses. The villagers she had delivered now gathered to watch her burn. Not all witches were midwives, of course. Some were widows, too old to remarry, too poor to be useful, too independent to be ignored. Others were simply different. Women who lived alone, refused confession, or spoke too boldly. The witch hunts were never about magic. They were about fear, fear of women without masters, women who could live without permission. Across Europe, laws codified that fear. In 1487, two inquisitors published Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a handbook that instructed judges on how to find, torture, and destroy women accused of sorcery. Its pages dripped with venom. Women, it declared, were weaker, more carnal, more easily corrupted by Satan. In its logic, every woman was a witch waiting to be discovered. The methods of justice were grotesque. Women were stripped, searched for devil's marks, and subjected to water tests, thrown into rivers with stones tied to their limbs. If they sank, they were innocent and drowned. If they floated, they were guilty and burned. The church called it purification by fire. It was murder disguised as holiness. And yet, even here, amid the terror, there was resistance. Some women confessed nothing, even under torture. Others cursed their judges to their faces, refusing to let fear turn them silent. In their defiance, they became more than victims. They became symbols. Their courage outlasted the flames that consumed them. The witch hunts were not just about religion. They were about reclaiming control. As Europe changed, as feudal systems crumbled and the world began to modernize, women's independence threatened the old order. The accusation of witchcraft became the final weapon to keep them contained. Every burned woman was a warning to the rest. Do not think, do not speak, do not stand alone. But the ashes left behind told another story, one the church could not erase. They carried whispers of the old world, of women who healed, who led, who understood the rhythms of the earth. The world may have renamed them witches, but they had been something else all along, the keepers of forgotten knowledge. When the flames died and the silence returned, Europe had lost more than women. It had lost its balance. The witch, the midwife, and the outcast were gone, and with them vanished centuries of wisdom that could never be recovered. But their ghosts lingered in the smoke, haunting reminders that when fear rules faith, truth burns first. When war swept across medieval Europe, it did not come as thunder and heroism. It came as fire, famine, and disease. Men marched to glory or graves, but the ones left behind, the women, faced a war of their own. A quieter one, a longer one. One fought not with swords, but with endurance. When armies clashed, villages burned. Men went to die for kings. Women stayed to rebuild what the kings destroyed. The chronicles of knights tell of banners and honor, but they forget the wives who watched their homes raided, their children starved, and their fields salted by marching soldiers. Behind every campaign of conquest was a trail of women burying the dead and tending to the living. The 100 Years' War turned much of France and England into wasteland. In that ruin, women became the backbone of survival. Peasant wives took up tools meant for men, managing farms, herds, and harvests alone. Noble women became regents, ruling estates while their husbands fought abroad. Some led militias to defend their lands. Women who had never held weapons now commanded them. War stripped away the illusion of frailty. Then came the Black Death, a horror beyond the reach of war. The plague arrived like a shadow that could not be fought or reasoned with. Whole families vanished within days. Cities fell silent. The church had no answers. The doctors had none either. But it was women, healers, midwives, nuns, who stayed with the dying when others fled. They washed bodies, comforted the sick, whispered prayers over the gasps of the dying. Many of them never rose again. And yet, from the ashes of the plague, something extraordinary emerged. The population collapse shattered the old hierarchies. With so many dead, women inherited lands, trades, and authority that had once been unthinkable. A widow could become a landowner. A daughter could run her father's business. A nun could rise to power within her convent. The same catastrophe that filled Europe's graveyards also cracked open the doors of opportunity. But freedom born from death came at a price. The survivors carried a new kind of scar, not on their bodies, but in their minds. They had seen the world end once and rebuild itself in their hands. They no longer believed that the order of things was unshakable. For a brief moment, women glimpsed a life beyond obedience. They could lead, decide, endure, because they already had. In chronicles written by monks, the plague years are described as divine punishment. But in the unrecorded lives of women, they were something else entirely. Revelation. The great myth of male stability had been undone. The world had survived only because women refused to die with it. Joan of Arc emerged from that same broken world, a living symbol of what women had become. A peasant girl who claimed the voice of God, she turned despair into defiance. She led men into battle, crowned a king, and was condemned by both crown and church. They called her a witch, a heretic, a madwoman. But her real crime was far simpler. She had proved that courage was not a man's inheritance. The wars would continue, and the plague would return. But in every village and every ruin, women learned that they could outlast anything: the law, the sword, even death itself. They endured not because the world allowed it, but because it gave them no other choice. The medieval world demanded silence from women, but the echo of their endurance filled the centuries that followed. They were the mothers of recovery, the guardians of memory, the unseen engineers of survival. And though their names rarely entered history, their will shaped it, quietly, irrevocably, like roots pushing through stone. In the medieval world, law was a weapon forged for men. It defined who could own, command, inherit, and who could not. Women were, in theory, possessions, daughters to be given, wives to be ruled, widows to be managed. Yet within that labyrinth of injustice, some learned to twist the rules, to bend them like iron softened by fire. They became masters of survival through cunning, paperwork, and patience. The church and the crown agreed on one thing: women were never meant to hold power. The legal doctrine of coverture declared that a married woman's identity was absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property, sign contracts, or even testify in court. In essence, the law turned her into a shadow, a being without rights, existing only through the man beside her. But shadows move where light cannot, and women learned to thrive in that darkness. Widowhood, grim as it was, became a strange form of liberation. A widow could inherit her husband's lands, run his shop, or collect his debts. Many did, and some became wealthy doing so. In medieval England, the merry widow became both admired and feared. Admired for her independence, feared for her refusal to remarry. To the law, she was a loophole. To her neighbors, a quiet revolution. In cities, women used guild systems to their advantage. While most guilds barred female members, a clever few found ways in. They became Brewsters and silk women, running businesses under their own names or as fictive partners with absent husbands. Records show women buying properties, suing debtors, even sponsoring apprentices. The men who wrote the laws often looked the other way, because commerce cared less for gender than for gold. Among the nobility, manipulation of inheritance became an art form. Daughters, denied titles, learned to bargain through marriage contracts, demanding dowries, jointures, and clauses that could grant them power later. Some used these agreements to rule lands outright when their husbands died. In rare but striking cases, noblewomen acted as feudal lords in all but name, dispensing justice, collecting taxes, and defending their estates. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, navigated a world of blood and betrayal with legal brilliance. Her signature built a dynasty that reshaped England forever. Even peasant women found cracks in the system. In manorial courts, where local disputes were heard, women appeared regularly, suing neighbors, defending property lines, contesting debts. The church might deny them a voice in theology, but in the marketplace and the village green, their voices echoed just fine. The more the law tried to silence them, the more creative they became. Still, the price of power was constant vigilance. A woman who fought too fiercely in court risked ridicule or accusation. A widow who managed her estate too well might be pressured to remarry, to return her property to male control. Even queens were not immune. When powerful women like Isabella of France or Margaret of Anjou ruled in their own right, they were accused of ambition, lust, or madness. The medieval world had no language for female authority except slander. But beneath the insults and sermons, the truth was undeniable. Women had learned the system better than the men who wrote it. They used faith, family, and law itself to carve out freedom inch by inch. A signature on parchment could be more powerful than a sword, and many women wielded it like one. The medieval woman's victory was not in overthrowing the system. It was in surviving it, manipulating it, and turning it to her favor without ever appearing to do so. They played the game that was rigged against them, and often they won. Their triumphs were small, quiet, almost invisible. But they built the foundation for centuries of change to come. Every property dispute fought, every contract signed, every inheritance defended was a whisper against the walls of patriarchy, a whisper that would one day become a roar. For a moment, it seemed as if women were beginning to slip through the cracks of history's great fortress. The plague had changed everything. The wars had emptied fields and towns. The laws had bent just enough for women to taste what independence felt like. But the Middle Ages had one more lesson to teach. Progress is fragile, and freedom, once glimpsed, can vanish faster than smoke. By the 15th century, the world was shifting. Feudalism was dying, replaced by early capitalism and the rise of centralized monarchies. New wealth flowed into the cities. Power shifted from land to money, from lords to merchants. And in this reordering of society, women, who had learned to live in the gaps of the old system, began to find those gaps closing. The church, threatened by its own corruption and the creeping secularism of the age, doubled down on control. Sermons thundered once more about the sins of women, the dangers of vanity, the need for chastity and silence. Where once women had been healers and midwives, they were now temptations. Where they had been spiritual visionaries, they were now witches. The Reformation would soon split Christendom apart. But long before Luther nailed his theses, the Church had already begun its war on the female body. Guilds that had once tolerated women's labor now expelled them. The rhetoric of order and propriety crept into civic law. Brewing, weaving, market trading, crafts once dominated by women, became male professions. Universities opened across Europe but barred female scholars. Printing presses carried knowledge to every corner of the continent, yet none of that ink was meant to preserve women's voices. They could copy texts, illuminate manuscripts, even teach sons to read, but their own words rarely made it to parchment. The new urban economies valued competition, hierarchy, and ownership, systems built by men, for men. Widows who had run businesses were suddenly seen as relics of a dying order. The law began to codify their exclusion. Property rights tightened, marriage contracts hardened, and the church sanctified male authority with new fervor. The independent woman became, once again, a social problem to be solved. Even in noble courts, where queens had once ruled in regency, women's power dimmed. Monarchs centralized authority and built bureaucracies filled with men. The role of the noblewoman returned to the domestic, birthing heirs, hosting guests, preserving appearances. The Renaissance would soon praise the ideal woman, learned, graceful, obedient, but it was only a prettier version of the same old prison. Worse still, the witch hunts intensified. As Europe entered a new age of reason, it turned on its women with renewed savagery. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, hundreds of thousands, most of them women, were tortured and executed. The old world was dying, and in its death throes, it demanded sacrifice. Women, once the backbone of survival, were scapegoated for everything that had gone wrong: disease, famine, rebellion, lust, sin. Their ashes fertilized the soil of Europe's rebirth. And yet beneath this descent, flickers of resistance endured. Women wrote letters, kept diaries, smuggled ideas. Some joined heretical sects that preached spiritual equality. Others disguised themselves as men to study, to fight, to see the world that had been denied to them. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, was a thread of continuity, keeping alive the quiet fire of female resilience. The Middle Ages ended not with the triumph of progress, but with a tightening of chains. As the modern world began to rise, it did so on the silenced backs of those who had built its foundations. Freedom had been glimpsed, briefly, fiercely, but it would take centuries for that memory to awaken again. And yet, history has a way of circling back. Every generation of women that came after would inherit not just the oppression, but the defiance, the knowledge that they had once endured worse and still found ways to live, to fight, to dream. The darkness of the late Middle Ages was not an ending. It was a deep breath before the next storm. History is a chorus, but for centuries, half the voices were silenced. The story of medieval women is not written in royal decrees or chronicles of conquest. It lives in fragments, in margins, in the quiet endurance of the forgotten. They were erased, mocked, condemned, and buried, yet the shape of their absence is unmistakable. The world that came after them still bears the imprint of their hands. The women of the Middle Ages did not rise in rebellion as an army, nor leave behind manifestos of freedom. Their revolution was quieter, a revolution of survival. Each time a peasant wife planted seed in scorched earth, each time a widow argued her right before a court, each time a nun set quill to parchment, they pushed against a system designed to erase them. These acts, small and invisible in their time, became the foundation of everything that came next. The threads of their labor wove the fabric of civilization. The midwife's knowledge became the seed of modern medicine. The weaver's skill built Europe's textile empires. The alewife's brewing traditions formed the roots of commerce. The nuns' scriptoriums preserved the wisdom of Greece and Rome, saving human knowledge through centuries of fire and plague. These were not tradwives or saints of submission. They were builders of worlds. Even their suffering reshaped history. The witch trials exposed the cruelty of faith weaponized by fear. The forced silence of convent walls birthed the first female philosophers. The laws that bound women's property forced later generations to rethink what justice even meant. Every time power tried to contain them, women turned that constraint into pressure. And pressure, over time, carves stone. In the Renaissance that followed, scholars praised human reason, but forgot the hands that had kept reason alive through centuries of darkness. Yet, in quiet defiance, women began to write again. Christine de Pizan, one of the first professional female authors in Europe, penned the Book of the City of Ladies, reclaiming history from the men who distorted it. Her vision was not fantasy. It was memory. She built, in words, a city of the forgotten, a home for every woman who had lived, fought, and been denied her place in history. The echoes did not stop there. When the Enlightenment demanded liberty, women remembered their ancestors who had lived without it. When revolutions tore through Europe, women stood beside men demanding equality. And when the suffragists raised their banners centuries later, they carried with them a spirit that had been tempered in medieval fields, kitchens, convents, and pyres. The modern woman's defiance wasn't born from nothing. It was inherited. Today, when we look back at the Middle Ages, we see darkness, plague, war, superstition. But in that darkness, women were the light that refused to go out. They were not the quiet trad wives of romantic myth, nor the powerless figures painted by later history. They were thinkers, fighters, healers, and survivors, the invisible architects of endurance. Their legacy is not carved in marble, but whispered in bloodlines and memory. It lives in every woman who dares to speak when told to be silent, who works when told to wait, who leads when told to follow. The medieval world tried to bury them under centuries of obedience, but the roots they planted grew deep, and their echoes reach us still. The Middle Ages may have ended, but the women who endured them never truly vanished. They linger in the courage of modern defiance, in every voice that refuses to be quiet, in every hand that builds against the odds. They were never tradwives. They were warriors without swords, rulers without crowns, saints without altars. And though history forgot their names, they changed it forever.